The day was drawing to a close, one of the few warm and bright days in an otherwise gloomy September. Along the dusty road cutting through the fields, peasants were returning from their work in a long line. Some walked heavily, bent under the weight of their tired bodies, while others moved lightly and cheerfully, joking with friends. From the doors and windows, the smells of dinner wafted out. On the trampled ground in the middle of the village, children were playing, making the most of the last hour before nightfall. Adults passing by smiled as they looked at the circles of small stones laid out on the ground. They had long forgotten the rules of this favorite game of the kids, which they themselves had played once. Martin, a stocky, red-haired boy of about 12, wandered around the group of playing children for a while, silently watching the game that he wasn't invited to join. He was too fond of himself and didn't know how to get along with other kids. Watching the game from the sidelines wasn't very entertaining, and eventually, Martin grew bored. So he decided to sit on the steps of the village church, still warm from the day's sun. From there, he could comfortably watch the travelers who stopped at the rickety tavern to quench their thirst and eat a piece of salted pork before continuing on their way. Those who wanted to avoid spending the night in the open field needed to hurry to reach the larger village further down the eastern road, where a well-known inn with decent rooms awaited. At first, Martin admired 3 wealthy merchants, their cart filled to the brim with goods, and a couple of guards. Then his attention was drawn to a pompous and quite self-satisfied monk with his servant, who had clearly had too much strong beer at the tavern. Compared to such noticeable figures, the other travelers weren't particularly interesting to the curious boy. Only when the merchants and monks disappeared from sight did Martin begin to scrutinize a stranger sitting nearby, also on the steps. This stranger was watching the children's game with apparent pleasure, leisurely eating cheese and bread and drinking from a flat flask. He seemed to be resting after a long journey. His boots and cloak were covered in dust, and even his face looked gray under a wide-brimmed hat. Unremarkable and unassuming, he resembled a mercenary, judging by his thick leather jacket, stiff cavalry boots, and an arsenal of pistols on his belt, accompanied by a short sword. Martin had seen many such soldiers, and they all looked so similar that he would have shifted his gaze to someone else if it weren't for the stranger's hat. Its high crown was adorned with a row of metal discs that glinted in the sun, and to get a better look at them, the boy moved closer. The man noticed him and turned his head sharply. "Hello, kid," he said. "Did you want to ask something?" "No," Martin mumbled. "I just like those discs on your hat. I've never seen anything like them before." "You've seen them? Seen them? How could you not have seen?" "They're ordinary medallions," the stranger replied, smiling. He took off his hat, dusted it off, and placed it on his fist, turning it to show the boy each disc. Some were new, smooth, and clean, while others were chipped and darkened. "Look, here's Jesus. He's at the front. Here to the right is the Virgin Mary. And who's this lady?" The boy pointed to a relief of a long-haired face. "The only beardless one besides Mary's." "That's the Apostle John," the man laughed. "He does look like a girl, doesn't he? What's your name?" "Martin." I don't have St. Martin." "And who's this here to the left of Jesus?" the boy asked, wondering who else could be on the front of the hat along with Christ and the Virgin Mary. "That's St. Hubert." The rough fingers of the stranger stroked the shiny silver oval. "What does he protect against?" "Nothing. He's the patron saint of hunting." "So you're a hunter, then?" "You could say that. A hunter." The man smoothed his thick light blonde hair, put the hat back on his head, and adjusted its wide brim. He pulled on his buffalo leather gloves. Then he put the flask in his travel bag, started to wrap up the bread and cheese, but changed his mind and offered them to Martin. "Take it if you want. God willing, I'll be at my destination by midnight and they'll feed me there." "Thanks," the boy replied, reaching for the food. The hunter immediately took an interest in his hand. Grabbing Martin unexpectedly tightly, he mused aloud as if to himself, "Your hand's all hairy. And your fingers?" Indeed, the 12-year-old boy's hand was as hairy as an adult man's, and his fingers were very knotted and dry. Martin tried to pull away, but the stranger's grip was like iron. "Let go. You're hurting me." The hunter didn't respond. He leaned forward, the brim of his hat touching the boy's forehead, to better examine something in Martin's eyes. He was no longer smiling, and his face had become frighteningly stern. Martin struggled again, and this time not only broke free, but also pushed the stranger so hard that he almost fell backward. "Well, you're a strong one, aren't you, lad?" the man said in surprise, frowning. He quickly stood up, brushed the crumbs of bread from his chest, and threw back the folds of his black cloak. "Martin, there you are. Come on, it's time for dinner," shouted a stout, red-haired woman who appeared from around the corner of the church. "How long must I look for you?" "Is he your son?" the hunter asked. "Yes, mine. And who might you be?" "Just a traveler," the stranger replied slowly, studying the hideous scars covering the left side of the woman's face and neck, as if someone had torn at her with their teeth. Noticing this, she covered her neck with a shawl, and then placed her hand on her son's shoulder. "Let's go, Martin. Your father and brothers are already eating." At that moment, the stranger drew a long pistol from his belt and immediately fired it at the boy, faster than anyone could fear or even move. A flash, a burst of flame, a cloud of smoke in the air. Martin staggered back, took a few steps, and then fell flat on his back. Bread and cheese rolled out of his hands onto the dusty ground. His mother only gasped, frozen in shock. While she and the other people were trying to understand what had happened, the stranger quickly approached a black horse tied to the tavern, grabbed the reins, and leaped into the saddle. Someone tried to stop him, but the stranger silently drew a double-barreled pistol and cocked the hammers. Everyone recoiled, and he spurred his horse, galloping away and disappearing from sight. The peasants watched him go, wondering who he was. The silence was broken only by the moans of Martin's mother, who was bent over her son. Sobbing, she looked at her boy's still face, barely seeing it through the veil of tears. Rags of clouds almost completely covered the moon, and from a distance, the only visible thing on the night road was the pale silhouette of a horse. Only up close could one discern the figure of a rider, wrapped in a cloak. He sat almost motionless, slightly leaning forward against the wind blowing into his face. Only when a long howl came from the forest on the left did the rider straighten up in the saddle and gaze intently into the tangle of branches. No one was ever seen, and the traveler would calm down again, lovingly stroking the stock of his crossbow but not in a hurry to discharge it. Of course, it was bad for the string, but it was better to replace it after a night ride than to ask an enemy to wait while the German trigger bent the shoulders of the steel bow. Meanwhile, the road continued to climb. Both the horse and the rider were tired, but they stubbornly pressed on through the darkness. Slowly and cautiously, to avoid tumbling down the rock-strewn cliff on the right side of the road, but without stopping, step by step, move by move, gradually approaching their goal. Against the sky, a darker shade of black finally became distinguishable, the outlines of towers and walls rising above the surrounding mountains. Not a single light indicated that there might be anything more alive there than ancient stones. The rider relaxed and sighed. The journey was coming to an end, as was another chapter in life. Morning would begin a new page in the book of his fate. Now he could discharge the crossbow and put away the bolt. The tip gleamed with silver and disappeared into the quiver, the trigger slowly releasing the string. And now the climb was behind. The road ended at high gates, fronted by an iron grill. They looked as if they hadn't been opened in a couple of centuries. The rider stopped his horse and waited. No signs, no knocks, no horn signals. Only someone invited could enter here. A torch flashed between the battlements. Then an arrow wrapped in a rag struck a wooden post by the gate, providing more light to the invisible observer. The rider threw back his hood, revealing the face of a girl about 17 years old. "Open up," came the voice of a guard from somewhere above. The heavy grill silently slid up. The gates creaked and opened. The girl urged her horse forward and rode inside. Another grill rose ahead, allowing her to enter the courtyard. "Welcome to the monastery," the guard said briefly, and he and his companion began to close the gates. A monk in the stable took care of the tired horse, and the rider hurried to the main building. On the porch, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a purple velvet doublet was already waiting, pacing impatiently. Of course, it was Hermann Urs, who couldn't sit still, waiting for his student. His face was aged by deep wrinkles and a gray beard, but the girl knew he hadn't yet fully reached 50 years old. "Melissa Mornevand? Oh, my child, you're finally here. We were starting to worry," he said, hugging her tightly. "Am I late?" "A little. Everyone else is already here." "And my brother?" "Of course. Theodore arrived before sunset. Let's go." The narrow corridors of the monastery weren't dark, but the light of the torches along the walls didn't give the ancient stones a warm amber hue. Their rough surface remained gray. The cool air filled the building with the scents of incense, burning candles, and fragrant herbs. Hermann led the way, confidently finding the necessary turns, and Melissa tried to keep up with him. The monks in white Dominican robes stepped aside, giving way, then watched the teacher and the girl from under their hoods. Melissa's heart was beating fast, not because of the speed at which they climbed the stairs and passed through the quiet chambers, but because it was her first time in the monastery, and the thought filled her with both pride and anxiety. Finally, they climbed a creaky spiral staircase to the top floor. Right in front of them was a slightly open black door, from behind which bright firelight spilled onto the floor. Melissa entered behind Hermann and found herself in a room lit by dozens of candles, resembling a hall in a small knight's castle. With colorful stained glass windows in narrow high windows, a wide and hot fireplace, and 3 long tables set up in the shape of a P. Each of these tables could accommodate a couple of dozen people, but only one was currently filled. Melissa recognized only half of those present, so she felt a bit shy when everyone turned to look at her. Shyness in the presence of strangers had always been her weakness, and she always tried to fight it. So now, feeling her anxiety grow and a blush spread across her cheeks, Melissa got angry at herself for not being able to remain calm. "Hello, sister," said her brother, approaching to lead her to the table. "What kept you?" My horse turned out to be worse than the merchant in Cologne promised. It tires too quickly." She didn't want to admit that she had initially taken the wrong road and arrived at the monastery 12 hours later than she intended. Her older brother's presence helped her calm down and relax. Theodore Mornevand had always taken care of his sister to the utmost, especially since their father's death, and Melissa was very attached to him, though she sometimes felt a bit frustrated that Theodore still saw her as a child. Of course, an 8-year age difference was significant, but she was no longer 10 or 15 years old, and it was time to make adjustments. Unfortunately, her conservative brother was exceptionally consistent in his habits, and it was hard to change an opinion he had already formed about something. Theodore immediately surrounded her with attention, pouring wine, cutting meat, reaching for distant dishes, and quietly explaining who the unfamiliar hunters were, giving clarifications when the general conversation touched on things unknown to her. He had changed little with age, both in appearance and character. His thick, light blonde hair, like his sister's, still fell in a mane on his shoulders. His eyes looked openly and directly with a constant twinkle at the corners. His full-blooded, lively face was quick to joy and sorrow, but any clouds only briefly darkened it before his unchanging love of life took over again. To many, this sanguine man might have seemed too ordinary because everything about him was moderate. He was slightly overweight, but not excessively, not short, but not much taller than average, loved to eat, but wasn't a glutton, enjoyed wine but never got drunk, and was fond of women but never lost his head over them. But for his sister, to love her brother, of course, required no special virtues. Gradually, her shyness faded, and now all that remained was pride in being in such a place, the nearly unknown monastery that had given refuge to the Morgenstern, a society of hunters of a special kind. Here gathered those who pursued and destroyed witches, vampires, werewolves, ghosts, and all other kinds of evil known to the earth since time immemorial. Damn it, all those years of training, they had seemed like true heroes to her, and now she was among them herself. They genuinely impressed Melissa, who was only preparing to move from theory to the practice of hunting. These people dealt with the supernatural, and thus seemed supernatural themselves. She imagined the dozens of adventures each of them must have had, the dozens of battles with evil where people came out on top. It couldn't be otherwise, since they were sitting here, because such a profession required a person to first and foremost eradicate one purely human trait, the tendency to make mistakes. As Hermann Urs used to say when teaching Melissa and other candidates for the Morgenstern, an inept and unlucky hunter meets death only once. A good hunter meets it many times. The table talk, of course, was about who had encountered what since the last gathering. Since failure almost always came at a high price, hunters had to learn as much as possible from others' mistakes and successes. Some stories were sad, and after them toasts were raised to another fallen comrade. Others, on the contrary, evoked laughter, especially the tale of how a charlatan, earning a living from the pretend hunt for witches, was forced to confront a real witch. Next to Melissa sat a hunter she had never seen before, but recognized from numerous stories as soon as her brother named him, Conrad Eisenholm. His appearance completely matched the common perception of a true vampire or witch hunter. Very tall, thin, with long bony arms and an unsmiling wrinkled face. He wasn't very old. Rather, he had aged prematurely due to an ascetic lifestyle and self-mortification, and the suffering he had endured in the past, about which no one knew anything for certain, also left a heavy mark. Even his hair had prematurely turned gray and hung lifelessly, resembling pale, thin roots of plants growing through the ceiling of an underground passage. During dinner, Conrad hadn't said a word, only ate black bread and washed it down with water, endlessly muttering the Pater Noster to himself. "Conrad, my friend, why aren't you joining our conversation?" Hermann Urs addressed him from the opposite side of the table. Eisenholm lifted his eyes from the contemplation of his silver plate and replied in a creaky but friendly voice. "You know, Hermann, I just prefer listening to talking. Don't you have anything to tell us?" "Not really. Nothing of much interest." The elderly hunter waved his translucent hand dismissively. "Oh, come on, Eisenholm. Tell us who your last victim was," Theodore asked. In the Morgenstern, they always referred to their enemies as victims or prey, emphasizing who was hunting whom. "The last victim," Conrad repeated, recalling. "I recently finished off a female vampire. Her name was Eliza." A murmur of approval ran through the ranks. Vampires were rightly considered among the most dangerous of all evil creatures, and victories over them were rare feats. "Eliza of Colmar or Eliza of Weissenberg?" asked a young hunter with a sallow, puffy face and large, lively eyes. "Of Colmar. My friend Athanasius had been tracking her for the last 5 years. But at the end of the summer, she came to him at night and killed him in his sleep. So I decided to finish my old friend's work myself." "Alone?" "I don't need company for such easy prey." Conrad smirked, and the smile on his bloodless lips resembled the first cut on a white corpse made by a doctor during an autopsy. "I thoroughly studied her history. She became a vampire 6 years ago with the help of Geraldino Vazzaro, a Venetian vampire whom our society has been unsuccessfully hunting for 3 centuries. Putting together the scattered information, I created the most likely picture of events. Eliza's first childbirth had been easy, but the second... The child was saved, but the mother was on the brink of death. That's when Geraldino probably appeared. He persuaded her to become the same damned creature for the Lord as he was, because her will was weakened not only by the desire to live but also by the attachment to her children. Quite an unusual case. Usually, those who become vampires have nothing in this life that means much to them, Theodore noted. Unusual, but it does happen. So I found out how she became a vampire. After that, I found her children. They still lived in the same old house on the outskirts of Colmar. A 6-year-old girl and her 8-year-old brother. As lovely as little angels, blonde and rosy. They were my bait, and I hired myself as their gardener. Vampires are too good at sensing outsiders, and if she had no explanation for my presence, I wouldn't have been able to get close unnoticed. Athanasius failed to find Eliza's lair, and so did I. So I killed her not during the day when vampires sleep, but at night, when she came to her children. She visited them twice a month. I had to lie in wait for her visit, but that wait was truly sweet to me. When the vampire finally appeared in the house, I had to delay a bit to calm my excitement. Eisenholm's face became so stern it was as if his enemy was standing before him again. Through the window, I saw perfectly how she played with her children. From the outside, Eliza looked alive. So cheerful, beautiful. But she was long a dead shell around a damned soul that had lingered too long on its way to hell, he exclaimed, slamming his fist on the table. Such a sudden display of strong emotions was all the more frightening because Eisenholm usually didn't even raise his voice. I entered the room. She rushed to the windows, but I had already hung crosses on them, just as I had on the door. She realized she was trapped and lunged at me, but I was well prepared for the fight. With these words, the hunter touched a bundle of amulets still hanging on his sunken chest. I finished her off right there in front of her beloved children, by all the canons. Chopped her up with a consecrated axe. Drove a silver-tipped stake into her heart, beheaded her, said a requiem prayer and watched as her cursed body burned to ashes in the holy fire. Melissa looked at Conrad and saw that he was calm again. The flash of fire in his eyes had faded, dissolved in the cold gray of his irises. I think her children should be grateful to you. You not only saved them from a possible fate, but also left a well-kept garden, observed one of the few women at the table, a charming brunette in a blue silk dress, in a melodic voice. Other hunters whispered in admiration. Few of them would have willingly fought a vampire at night during its time. Eisenholm hadn't told how he had actually defeated the vampire, but it must have been a hard task, truly worthy of the living legend that he was. And it was evident that despite all his modesty and indifference to praise, the reverence of the young hunters for his skill greatly warmed the old hunter's heart. Several more stories were told, but they didn't impress Melissa as much as the slaying, or rather, the deserved execution of the vampire in her children's home. She remembered all the information about this type of evil written in her notebooks, and could imagine what incredible willpower the outwardly fragile Eisenholm needed to accomplish his plan. The girl pictured herself in his place, and the thought of such a situation made her fear her possible fear, her possible weakness. She scolded herself for this sensitivity just as she did for her shyness, and tried to distract herself from such thoughts by listening more attentively to the conversation. At night, Melissa was placed in a narrow cell where monks had already made up the hard bed with a clean sheet. They woke her by knocking on the door before dawn and invited her to the morning service. After quickly washing, she stepped into the corridor and followed a stooped servant to the monastery church. The sounds of choral singing, hovering somewhere under the vaults, the silent figures of the monks, the smell of hot wax and incense, made the strongest impression on the not yet fully awake mind. This ordinary service seemed solemn and special, and the girl felt as if God was listening to her very closely, because now this church, like a ship, had sailed very close to him. Melissa prayed simply and sincerely, easily asking God to give her the strength to endure future battles, prayed for her mother's health and for her brother's safety. She had never had any complaints about the strength of her faith. On the contrary, this girl of the 17th century had a faith as strong as that of people who lived 5 or 6 centuries earlier. One by one, the other members of the Morgenstern approached. It is said that even the most convinced atheists can suddenly turn to religion in war, and the Morgenstern had been waging a war for centuries. It was no surprise that the hunters of evil felt the need for prayers, which allowed them to ease the constant tension a little. Besides, it had long been known that despite the protective properties of some plants, stones, and silver, the best means of fighting the spawn of the night was sincere faith, including such forms as faith in the power of holy water or consecrated weapons, which by themselves did not possess any special properties. When the service ended and everyone began to go about their business, Hermann Urs approached Melissa. "Good morning, Miss Mornevand," he said. "Come, it's time to decide what you will be doing." He led her back to the same hall where the dinner had been lively the night before. Now there was no one there except her brother. Energetically working with a spoon and knife, Theodore was having breakfast of lentils and cold meat by the light of a few candles that dispelled the grayness of the cloudy morning. "Ah, hello, sister. Sit down and eat. There's enough for you too." "You're eating meat on a Friday?" she asked, surprised. "I know today is a fasting day, but the members of the Morgenstern are exempt from the need to abstain from meat, just as this permission was once granted to the knightly orders in Palestine." He served her a plate of aromatic lentil soup, cut some bread, and gave her a spoon, then took a jug and refilled his own cup with beer. "Not the best drink, but it'll do for lack of wine," Theodore sighed, sitting back down. "There is wine in the monastery," Hermann noted. "But is it really wine? It's either 4 or 5 years old. It's all long since turned sour. Wine, like women, should be young. I can't understand why the ancient Romans valued aged wine so much." Melissa began to eat the lentils with pleasure. Well cooked and adequately salted, this hot food was just right, as she had developed quite an appetite during the morning service. I want to talk about your sister, Urs said, sitting next to Theodore. You think she's ready to participate in a hunt? Exactly. Melissa, you see, your brother resisted my suggestion to summon you to this monastery for a long time. He thought you weren't yet prepared for real work. Herman smiled into his beard. Only recently did I manage to persuade him. Theo, you always see me as a child. When will that end? The girl sighed. Her older brother shrugged. Probably when your time comes. I've told you more than once, and I'll repeat it again. She is ready. Trust my experience, said the old teacher. The same Mornevan blood runs in her veins as in yours. She even has something you lack. What? Faith. Theodore frowned. My faith was shot down by arquebuses when I was in the army. So you think Melissa is ready? Fine. Then what do you want from me, Herman? She needs to be assigned to a trio. Hunters always work in threes. We can't survive alone. And I wanted to know if you'd like to take your sister into your own trio or if it's better to ask someone else. Lately, the Morgenstern has suffered many losses, so we can even choose among different trios that have vacancies. Theodore stood up and went to the window, opened the pane made of colorful pieces of glass, and looked down into the courtyard. There was no rain yet, but the sun couldn't break through the leaden clouds. The diffused, weak light made everything around as gray as the sky. The wind, entering the hall, began to flap the white shirt the young man was wearing. What a weather, Theodore muttered, shivering. Both Herman and Melissa knew the character of the elder Mornevan well. Since childhood, he had liked to avoid awkward questions by talking his interlocutors into forgetting what they wanted to know. Then it became a habit, and quickly switching his attention to other subjects and then back to the problem at hand helped him find the right solution. It was clear that Theodore was seriously considering the choice, and indeed at that moment he was thinking through each alternative, imagining the consequences. On the one hand, he didn't want his sister to be nearby during a deadly battle because her presence would distract him and cause too much worry for little Melissa's safety. On the other hand, Theodore didn't want to entrust his sister's protection to someone else. He understood that no matter how experienced the people she went on a hunt with, he would still feel that he could take care of her much better. Mornevan closed the window and returned to the table. Both options seemed equally unsuitable to him. Of course, it would be better if she stayed home and chose another profession. Damn the day he boastfully told her what he was really doing. Who knew it would attract her so much? But a decision had to be made. What do you want yourself? He asked. Of course, to be with you if possible. Melissa didn't even consider the possibility that her brother wouldn't be with her when she first encountered evil. All right, let her be in my trio. I personally want to finish her training, he said aloud. It will be safer for me this way. It's more dangerous but safer, he thought to himself. From the point of view of a teacher and a soldier, this choice is wrong. Urs shook his head. But I still approve of it because my heart tells me it's for the best. Now I'll help you get equipped, sister. We'll leave before noon, Theodore announced. Have you already found a third for your team? The old teacher was surprised. No, but there's a hunt that can't wait. Conrad Eisenholm told me yesterday that he had found the whereabouts of an old acquaintance of mine, the one who was called Gunther Weiss when he was human. The goldsmith from Bremen. That's the one. Conrad accidentally spotted his traces while tracking one of his own victims, and since he remembered that I had been trying to destroy this creature for almost a year, he found out more. Weiss is hiding in an abandoned village a day's journey from the city of Ulm along the Danube River. Eisenholm showed me this place on a map, so we need to hurry. I've been chasing this monster for too long to miss a good chance. If he manages to disappear again, we'll be back to searching for him in the woods." Theodore was burning with excitement, and any delay seemed unbearable to him. He knew Hermann would object to hunting with an incomplete team, but such arguments held no weight for him now. "You're making a mistake, Mornevand. First form a trio and then go hunting. You know that the custom of working in threes wasn't born out of nowhere. It's a lesson written in blood. In a trio, each person has specific duties, and all action plans are pre-calculated. You know our rules. None of them are meaningless. Ignoring them often leads to death. Well, I'm still alive, and I've never been one to strictly follow the letter of the rules." "You're alive. But what about the other two in your trio?" Theodore fell silent and lowered his eyes. He wasn't the kind of person to be guilt-tripped so easily. Moreover, he felt no guilt for the recent failure, having carefully analyzed it and found no fault in himself. Out of politeness, he had to at least pretend that Hermann's words were taken into consideration. Melissa really wanted to ask how Theodore's friends had died, but she felt it wasn't the right time to talk to him about it. After a while, the young man raised his head and waved his hand. "Come on, I'm not going after vampires this time. Weiss isn't even a real werewolf. He's not particularly difficult. Now that we know his hideout, we just need to go and catch him to bring him here for study. He's a unique specimen, with no analogs or even a name. It would be great to get him for our laboratory." "Precisely. He's unique," the teacher persisted, defending his position partly out of principle and partly because he taught this to the young recruits year after year and had to be honest with himself. "You don't know all his abilities or how he managed to fool you several times and nearly kill you. Pure luck. That often? That's too much for luck. And you're not Eisenholm, who can handle any enemy alone." Mentioning the legendary hunter was a mistake on Ursa's part. Even if Theodore had doubted the need for reckless actions, this would have reignited his enthusiasm. Besides, Mornevand was already experiencing a surge of energy and excitement, reminiscent of his cavalry days before a headlong attack with equal chances of breaking through the Landsknecht's lines or being cut down by a volley of arquebuses. After all, those who joined the cavalry had very understandable character traits. Melissa also wanted to go quickly to test herself in the hunt, but her discipline protested against breaking the rules. So she said nothing, but her fiery gaze further strengthened her brother's resolve. "No, Hermann. I've made up my mind. We're going." "Well, damn you both, go. You Mornevands are both stubborn to the extreme, and I wash my hands of it." The old teacher unexpectedly laughed. Deep down, he was glad he couldn't shake Theodore's confidence. A certain amount of audacity suits a good hunter. Besides, Hermann didn't know if his caution was correct or if it was just the age that had cooled his blood. "The arsenal. How I love the preparation stage," Theodore almost purred. This sanctum sanctorum of the Morgenstern was located deep underground behind an iron-bound door. The silent gatekeeper, a sullen, lame man with an unusually long nose, refused to give them the keys and descended with the Mornevands to unlock the numerous locks himself. Having performed this high duty, he sat on a bench at the entrance and began clicking the beads of his rosary. What the hunters would do inside was none of his business. His main concern was to securely lock everything when they were done. Theodore entered first, lighting torches along the walls from his own. Once it was bright enough, Melissa looked around and thought this place remarkably resembled the library in the Dominican Abbey where she had studied under Hermann Ur's sturdy shelves rose forward and upward, but instead of books and scrolls they held weapons, amulets, and quite mundane items like hourglasses, bundles of candles, or blocks of wax. The girl looked at them without much interest, for now they were not life-saving tools but torture instruments from her recent exams. Theodore watched with a warm smile as his sister walked along the shelves, examining silvered sabers, aspen stakes, witch detectors, and protective talismans. How she's grown, he thought. That's what happens when you only see each other in passing for a couple of days at home. A brother's partial view couldn't tell how beautiful his sister was. For him, she would always be the best. "First, let's decide on the armament," he finally said. "What would you like to take?" "I have weapons. Herman gave me a sword when I passed my final exams. Besides, I bought myself a crossbow." "What kind of sword?" "Just consecrated, I suppose, and nothing else?" "Well, yes, consecrated. What else could it be?" Melissa was surprised. "With a silver coating." "Is it enough for close combat? You can find something better here?" "It's plenty. In the exam, we had to kill a ghoul in the arena, and I did better than anyone. The sword almost decapitated him." A good choice for a training monster, Theodore thought. Ghouls are just corpse eaters, more disgusting than dangerous, but they're nimble. Just right for a hunter candidate, whereas I had to learn on the fly with a real werewolf. He felt a suppressed jealousy. He hadn't been lucky enough to receive such training from the best teachers. Theodore was more of a self-taught hunter, acquiring missing knowledge from his own mistakes, a dangerous method in his trade. Herman Urs had already told him that Melissa was more gifted and would become a more successful hunter than her brother, and the elder Mornevand had then rejoiced for his sister. Apparently deep down, a residue remained, some envy or wounded pride, stinging more and more with each proof of Melissa's strength. For example, relying on a simple consecrated sword was not an option for Theodore, and even a ghoul wouldn't fall to him without a more powerful weapon. But his sister seemed to consider her sword invincible, and that made it so. Let's assume close combat is settled. What about ranged? The crossbow, also consecrated. Steel bow? Yes, with a German trigger. Theodore nodded, fully satisfied. A good choice. Many of us prefer crossbows. In war, they no longer compete with arquebuses, but on any kind of hunt, they are indispensable due to their many advantages. Wouldn't you like to take something with gunpowder? His sister waved her hand dismissively. I don't like firearms. Too inaccurate compared to the same crossbow. Too loud. Too much hassle with reloading. Coarse powder, fine priming powder, wads, bullets. And it needs cleaning, repairing, replacing the flint. And the smoke quickly soils clothes and face. It's your choice. Theodore gave her a sly look. He was one of those hunters whom colleagues called pistoleros. Reloading takes too long. Then take a couple of pistols on the belt, another 2 or even 4 in saddle holsters, a leather crossbelt with 4 or 5 across the chest, and the problem is solved. Inaccurate? Then get closer. And there are such long-barreled pistols to which you can add a stock section if necessary, a carbine which is easier to aim with. The main thing is that the shot's power surpasses the best crossbows, not to mention bows. Now for protection. Do you have chainmail? No. We'll find some now. A light but strong chainmail was found, along with gloves of tough leather and a steel gorget to protect the neck. Then Theodore began wandering between the shelves himself, collecting items he deemed necessary. Protective amulets against werewolves and vampires, a set of crosses, silver stakes, a simple compass, a witch's compass, with a needle floating in holy water that always points to the nearest witch, and much more. He took one item, another, remembered something else essential, went back. Of course, most of it probably wouldn't be needed, but the hunter preferred to anticipate every contingency, as it was his sister's life at stake. He would have been content with a minimal set himself. Melissa packed the items her brother handed her into her bag without objection. She enjoyed his care and just smiled, watching Theodore's bustle. When the elder Mornevand was satisfied with his protégé's equipment, he had to decide if he needed anything for himself, but nothing came to mind. It seemed he had already prepared everything the night before after Eisenholm told him about the discovered monster. "We have new grenades," the gatekeeper suddenly said, "on the shelf next to you." He said this and then returned to his beads. Theodore turned. In a box lay spheres with explosives. Rows of their round sides reminded him of exotic treats, oranges brought from afar at Christmas, and sold at exorbitant prices. These grenades differed from regular ones in their smaller power and size. Hunters needed them for single enemies, as the minions of the night, thank God, didn't yet form battalions. Ah, finally. I've been waiting for them. He took them out of the box like a child takes gifts from a Christmas box. At first he wanted to take 6, but reason asked how to carry such a weight, and in the end Mornevand's greed settled on 3. "Aren't you afraid to carry them in your bag?" his sister asked, seeing how carelessly Theodore threw the grenades. "Nothing to worry about as long as the fuse isn't lit," he smiled. "At such moments it seems like I'm not the younger child between us," Melissa thought, tying her bag. "There's a beast in every person. Some let it out." Gunther Weiss was from Bremen. In his youth he was taken as an apprentice by a jeweler, and after many years of study and work, the young man was fortunate enough to replace his master and become a full-fledged goldsmith. He wasn't capable of anything truly outstanding, but was still considered the best in the city and surrounding areas. He married well and bought a good house. In short, his life was just wonderful, until a new jeweler appeared in Bremen, a certain Klaas from Antwerp. Naturally, he set up shop on the same street as Gunther. In Bremen, as in other cities, craftsmen settled by profession. On the river bank were potters who needed clay. Closer to the outskirts were the smelly tanners and dyers, noisy blacksmiths, and charcoal burners. But goldsmiths could settle in a privileged area, closer to potential customers. So Master Klaas set up his shop, and from then on, Gunther had no peace. He jealously watched as clients went to his competitor. How many people, how much they bought. Very soon, everyone in the city knew. Klaas made jewelry that was hard to match, even if you traveled the whole world. Weiss didn't lose his income. The newcomer from Antwerp kept his prices too high, and not everyone could afford to go to him. But the awareness of the stranger's superiority gnawed at his mind like a hungry dog at a sweet bone. Friends would tease him, saying that he couldn't make a ring or a diadem as elegantly as Klaas. Such conversations brought no joy to Weiss, and the more skilled Klaas became, the more Gunther envied him. Then, one frosty December morning, the master from Antwerp was found torn to pieces in his own home. The terrified maid swore it had been done by a huge beast covered in golden fur. In the middle of the night, the monster had smashed through the sturdy door, attacked Klaas, wreaked havoc in his home, and then disappeared into the darkness of the night streets. Not a single window was lit, not to mention a lantern. Friends noticed that Gunther Weiss was happy. The highly skilled craftsman would no longer cause him grief. Then the monster appeared again in Bremen, 12 times in one winter. Always in the craftsman's quarters. Sometimes it killed the best engraver, sometimes the well-known shoemaker. The last victim, a tailor, was a brave lad and didn't go down easily. He woke the entire house with the noise of the fight and managed to get out into the street. Luckily for him, the night watch was passing by. The guards saw the tailor fighting off the beast with his grandfather's falchion and rushed to help, firing several shots. The monster fled, but it had a hard time. A trail of blood drops stretched along the pavement. The watchman followed it for 2 blocks, but then the trail went into the river and disappeared. The brave tailor, however, died from his wounds right there on the street, not even making it to a hospital. The next morning, it was discovered that Weiss had disappeared from the city. His wife said he had left on business, but people still looked at their house with suspicion and started talking. When a week later the wife also disappeared, they openly declared that Gunther was the monster, a werewolf, cursed by God for his envy. After that, the golden-furred beast was spotted in various places in Germany, and soon the Morgenstern took an interest in the strange case. Members of the society went to all the corners where the golden-furred werewolf had been seen. They talked to survivors and witnesses, compared facts. Step by step, they reconstructed the full picture. This is how they learned the whole story of Gunther Weiss, which Theodore recounted to his sister on the way to the city of Ulm. Again, Melissa was afraid to ask how the other two hunters in Theodore's trio had died. She also didn't start a conversation about why it had been so long and difficult to capture or destroy Gunther Weiss. They traveled quickly. Theodore mentioned that when he served in the cavalry, they would cover 3 whole Saxon miles and a third each day, 5 days a week, with 2 days of rest. Now, each of them had 2 horses, one for riding, the other resting, walking unburdened. This way, by switching from saddle to saddle, they covered 8.5 Saxon miles each day. The horses didn't need stops, resting better on the move than standing still due to a strange equine peculiarity. Accustomed to such transitions, Theodore handled them with ease. With his sturdy build, he had always lagged behind his peers in races during his childhood. But this only deepened his love for horses, and he often spent more time riding than standing on solid ground. His sister, on the other hand, was somewhat afraid of horses, perhaps because, being slim and short, she perceived them as huge and dangerous creatures, although they had never harmed her. During the long ride, Melissa bruised her buttocks and grew tired of the constant swaying, but she did not say a word to her older brother, whether out of pride or that deeply hidden shyness. Conversation during the journey initially did not flow well, much to Theodore's disappointment. He loved to talk a lot, talk loudly, and not always about relevant matters, as long as it wasn't silence. After telling his sister the story of their prey, he quickly inquired about all the news from home. They exchanged a few words about the weather, which left much to be desired, and then fell silent, finding no more topics. In truth, the only point connecting their inner worlds was their shared profession, but neither brother nor sister wanted to talk about Morgenstern. The elder Mornevan suddenly realized that he knew absolutely nothing about Melissa, as all his knowledge about her favorite games and books was apparently outdated. Love and care not only do not need anything besides the object, but can exist without any connection to the qualities of that very object. His sister had grown up, transformed from a girl into a young woman, and simultaneously became a completely different, unfamiliar person. Usually one can only see the most distant traces of childhood in an adult. It was possible to start a conversation about what interested the hunter himself, but that seemed useless and even rude. The rain never truly broke through the gray veil of clouds, only occasionally spreading a fine mist that unpleasantly chilled the face and dampened clothes. It seemed the sky had heard the hunter's prayers, and did not allow the rain to pour down fully and ruin the road. They passed through villages, hamlets, and small towns, even those without walls to protect their 100 or so inhabitants. Theodore knew the road well, and he also knew the best places to replenish supplies and rest for the night. Only once did Melissa express surprise when her brother directed the horses along a bypass road instead of continuing on the main route. "I thought this path was closer to Ulm," she said, urging her horse to ride alongside Theodore. "It is," he replied, "but we're taking a detour." "Why? Do you think the direct route is unsafe? We should find a place to stay for the night." The elder Mornavan glanced grimly at the October sun peeking through a narrow break in the grayness. It was almost touching the ground. The hunter pondered for a moment, whether to lie to his sister or tell the truth, then confessed, "I don't want to go to that village. I was there a month ago and left a rather unpleasant memory. I shot a werewolf." "Why is that an unpleasant memory?" "Because the werewolf was only about 13 years old and was a werewolf only, so to speak, in potential, as your teacher Herman would say. He looked like an ordinary boy, and no one in the village even suspected that a beast was lurking inside him. And I didn't waste time on explanations. At that stage, ordinary people wouldn't have believed it." "How did you recognize him as a werewolf?" Melissa asked. "There were several signs. Hair all over his body, like an adult man or even more. Eyebrows that met in the middle. Too strong for his age. And most importantly, eyes not like normal people. It's hard to explain. I'll show you the eyes of such a hidden werewolf sometime, and you'll never confuse them with anything else. This is the first time I've heard of hidden werewolves. You weren't told about them? It's actually a rare case. Usually a person becomes a monster through their vices. They're too strong emotions that wound the soul. True werewolves can be reclusive, extremely selfish individuals. Gunther Weiss, whom we are now heading for, became a monster out of envy. That's his uniqueness. But a hidden werewolf becomes an innocent child, simply because it was in the womb when the mother was bitten by wolves. No one knows when the beast will awaken. Before 12 years old, it's rare, most often between 15 and 30. After 50, there's no more danger. By then, the human nature has completely prevailed. The awakening moment of such a werewolf is always horrifying. In response to a blow or even an insult, they can't hold back their rage and turn into a monster that will tear the offender apart and then continue to sow death in the area. So, once I realized the boy carried such a danger, I killed him. Shot him point blank. The confession was hard for him, but that's why he decided to confess to his sister, the dearest person on earth, in whose eyes he especially wanted to be impeccable, as if fulfilling a severe penance. What if you were wrong? No? What if he wasn't a hidden werewolf but a healthy child? He wasn't. I've been in the Morgenstern for years, and any hunter will tell you there are few who know werewolves better than Theodore Mornavan. Couldn't you have given the boy a chance? Maybe he could have controlled the beast? A chance. Others would have paid too dearly for that chance. And when deciding whether to sacrifice one life or put many at risk, the hunter's answer can only be one. He finally dared to lift his head and look at his sister. Melissa was torn between two conflicting feelings. Her heart rejected the cruelty of the verdict, but at the same time, her mind understood her brother and imagined how difficult a choice he had to make. Situations like this are among the most common and hardest in our profession, the hunter continued. When I was younger, I also struggled with doubts. I sought answers in the books of the Holy Fathers. Neither Thomas Aquinas nor Blessed Augustine spoke of what to do in such a case. But I read them carefully and understood that the hunter's duty is to destroy the traces of evil without hesitation. Of the beings we kill, many could have healed and saved their souls. However, for a member of the Morgenstern, a fleeting chance doesn't matter. We must destroy the enemy where we see it, without thinking about possible alternatives. The enemy is an enemy, and that's enough. Melissa didn't respond, and her brother looked into her eyes in vain. At least there was no reproach in them, and that was enough. He didn't like to talk about such topics. The constant need to weigh, decide, judge, all without the right to error, always on a knife's edge. It was something unnameable, suppressed by his usual cheerfulness and optimism, but no matter how far he pushed such thoughts away, they always returned. "Let's hurry, sister. I know a place where we can get to before nightfall." And he spurred his horse into a brisk trot. The hours before dawn dragged as slowly as silver melting in a ladle for casting bullets. Theodore said that in the dark, Gunther Weiss would be stronger, so they waited for the hunter's hour, the hour when the day had just begun, when the servants of the night were even weaker than at noon. This peculiarity gave the society its name, Morgenstern. The dilapidated cabin where they waited out the night seemed to have belonged to a forester, but judging by the neglect, no one had come here for years. Initially, Theodore had planned to stay in some ravine, so when Melissa wished to be elsewhere, she reminded herself that any other place would probably be less appealing than this abandoned hut. Theodore lit a fire in the hearth and tightly closed the shutters so the light wouldn't be visible from outside. However, the closed windows scared the girl. She felt as if a werewolf was creeping up to them unnoticed. The night before, she had finally asked her brother if Gunther had killed the two hunters from his trio, and received an affirmative answer, though not one encouraging further details. Melissa suspected her brother had downplayed the danger their enemy posed in his conversation with Hermann Urs at the monastery. Now her anxiety only grew, despite all attempts to gain strength by reading prayers or checking her weapons. Two reliable methods, equally effective. For one never hears as many sounds in the forest as with heightened senses at night, in the forest where a werewolf lurks. Nevertheless, her brother remained as calm as ever, his perpetual smile undiminished. He sat on a low bed in the corner, laying out his entire arsenal and meticulously checking each charge in every pistol. Then, the elder Mornavand reviewed the stock of bullets, regular powder, and priming powder. Watching his actions, which were not whims but constant necessities, Melissa again thought that firearms weren't for her. As she had recently told her brother, she mainly disliked them because they were not only inaccurate and unreliable, but also required a lot of maintenance, from cleaning to replacing flints, and sometimes even repairs in the field. For instance, the wheel lock, the only useful invention by Leonardo da Vinci, almost always needed to be taken to a watchmaker for replacement of small parts, of which it had over 100 after 36 shots. The flintlock, of course, was more durable and could be repaired independently, but it was not as reliable. And this was not to mention the problems with powder, which, in Melissa's opinion, if it didn't get damp, would misfire. And if it didn't misfire, it would blow off the priming pan. No. Better stick with the good old crossbow. Noticing how closely his sister was watching him tidy up his pocket artillery, the hunter said, "If you think this is tedious, you're mistaken. I even enjoy it." He gently ran his hand over the barrel of the longest pistol. Each of these little things contains years of searching and honing craftsmanship. Various people have spent decades improving the trigger spring, barrel production, and other details. Others experimented with powder composition, invented granulation, new lock designs. So, what better response could humanity have to the forces of the night? Finished with the preparations, Theodore took out a book he had thoughtfully brought along and calmly settled down to read. It was a work by Cervantes, recommended to him by a Spanish soldier when it had just been published. The hunter had already read the book twice, and now started it for the third time, driven by the vague suspicion that nothing greater would be written in the coming centuries. The first time, Don Quixote seemed amusing to him. The second time, sad. and now both, making both laughter and sorrow much more intense. The image of the mad hidalgo seemed strangely close to the profession of hunting evil. Windmills reminded him of the burned women who weren't witches at all, and the flock of sheep of the people mistakenly taken for the possessed when they were actually epileptics. However, of course, such blindness was mostly allowed by ignorant peasants and clerics, not the Morgenstern. Funnily enough, even the sinister Inquisition fought against popular superstition in these matters but could do nothing about it, especially since the Protestants, on the contrary, encouraged witch trials. Melissa, meanwhile, sat by the window, wrapped in her travel cloak against the cold. She listened to every sound outside, expecting the door to burst open at any moment before whoever had come for them from the heart of darkness. Several times she was ready to swear she heard footsteps near the house, but then everything went quiet again. So her sword lay on the table, drawn, and the flame of the oil lantern flickered on the polished steel. The girl remembered a simple truth. The forces of evil are many times stronger than any mortal who dares challenge them. The night did not belong to humans, and was a time to lock doors tighter and pray to God with all the saints. So now, when the gaps in the shutters showed that dawn had not yet come, Melissa felt as if someone was closely watching the forester's hut. She usually had a very sharp sense of the presence of evil, so there was no doubt this time either. It was wandering nearby. Early in the night, Theodore had brewed some strange liquid in a pot, brown in appearance, pleasant in smell, and vile in taste. According to him, it was very popular in captured Constantinople. After drinking it, Melissa shook off her sleepiness, but the waiting soon bored the young huntress. She repeatedly opened the locket watch hanging around her neck, but the single-hour hand seemed to be sleeping, barely moving. She had long known that the watch ran rather inaccurately and could be considered more of an ornament than a useful item. Finally, to pass the time, she took out her notebook with lecture notes from her training and began rereading the chapter on werewolves. Descriptions of their abilities, weaknesses, habits, and ways to destroy them. The elder Mornevand occasionally glanced at his sister over his book, understanding that she was experiencing fear but unable to help. On the first hunt, everyone must overcome their weakness, even if the wait is agonizingly long. For Theodore it was easier. The war had dulled his ability to be afraid of anything. He had seen enough horrifying scenes there. The aftermath of artillery fire, hand-to-hand slaughter, hospitals full of wounded and soldiers spreading out through villages, looting, raping, and killing, the classic triad of actions. What some vampire might do paled in comparison to what humans could do to each other. Humanist writers repeat over and over that wars are started by villainous kings and scoundrel generals, and that it would be better if they fought out their differences alone without involving ordinary people. Mornevand had long understood that it wasn't so. Ordinary soldiers were often no better or worse than those who commanded them. The human mass is always homogeneous, no matter where you take samples. A portion of saints, a portion of beasts in human guise, and the rest, just grayness. Yet, Theodore had lived well in the army. He accepted the established order there and even found positive aspects in it. Initially driven by a desire to serve his country, then to gain promotion, and finally, just a habit of that lifestyle. A craving to plunge repeatedly into the madness of cavalry charges and the ensuing melee. He wasn't alone. Even veterans more regretted not being able to participate in new campaigns than losing a limb, which led to their retirement. Why did Mornevand leave this free, drunken life in the saddle of a Rhaetar? He couldn't say, although he often searched for the answer. Hermann Urs reproached him. A hunter of evil must know exactly what he is fighting for, must have the torch of an idea or the beacon of hope to lead him out of dire straits. Some joined the Morgenstern for revenge, some out of scholarly interest, some from a sincere belief in God and the need to fight his enemies, like Melissa. Yes, Herman said she truly believed. It was a rare gift, easily lost but almost impossible to regain. It's the most reliable armor the soul can wear. It makes it clumsy and limited in movement, but it's still protective armor, though some might compare it to the blinkers on skittish horses. With true faith, one could indeed go against evil with only a consecrated sword, and it would cut through the toughest flesh of the servants of the night. With true faith, one could repel a ghost or break a vampire's spell with just a prayer. But the hunter felt this great power likely came not from some higher being, but from the person themselves. Theodore had seen that it didn't matter who the fanatic believed in: Jesus, Yahweh, Allah, or pagan gods. The main thing was sincerity. But knowing this, how could he sincerely pray? Mornevan still prayed. Words sanctified by generations of believers were effective, even when uttered by the parched lips of an unbeliever. Just as a weapon that had defended a true believer's life reliably sent evil to hell. It was borrowed holiness, but fortunately it was enough. Otherwise Morgenstern would have long ceased to exist, as each century saw more people believing not in the Lord, but in godless science and their strength. Trying to step silently and hide behind any protrusions, they still felt as uneasy as if they were walking across an open field in full view. Slowly, step by step, past gray walls and gates creaking in the wind. Finally, the hunters stopped, kneeling behind the corner of the last building before the one with the lit window. After examining the target, Theodore whispered to his sister, "There's mica in the window. You can't see through it. So I'll go to the door. It's not locked, just closed. I'll look inside. If the prey is there, I'll treat it to a grenade. You wait for the explosion, then quickly go to the window. How many bolts can you shoot in a minute?" 2. Good. Don't be afraid to shoot. If I throw a grenade, there are only enemies inside. And he smiled, patting the tense Melissa on the shoulder. It'll be fine. Gloria Patri, et Filio, et Spiritui Sancto. Sicut erat in principio, et nunc, et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen, his sister replied, raising her crossbow. Chainmail softly clinking, Theodore crept to the window, crawled under it, and circled the door to look into the room through the gap. He saw a table and a man sitting at it with his back to the door. Even from behind, it was recognizable: Gunther Weiss himself. Theodore grinned with relief. They had rushed for a reason, and carefully drew a double-barreled pistol from his belt. He glanced at his sister, encouraging her with his eyes. She would be safe outside, and that was the main thing. Damn, why is it that after meticulously planning battles and calculating possible outcomes, I always end up at the door ready to burst in, firing from all barrels? He thought, extracting a grenade from his belt pouch and bringing its fuse to the smoldering one. The slow match delayed the explosion for some time, and he had to choose the right moment to throw it, not giving the enemy time to take cover. Feeling the moment was right, Mornevan flung the door open, threw the grenade inside, and jumped aside. It exploded with a loud bang, sending a flock of birds from the black roofs. The wall behind him trembled, and the mica flew out of the window. Drawing another double-barreled pistol, the hunter kicked the door open and burst in, firing both barrels at the body sprawled on the floor. He likely missed the target. Something darted out from behind the door, and with a powerful blow, flung Theodore back outside. The hunter hadn't recovered from the shock, and didn't understand who had attacked him, but the enemy was already on him, clawing at the chainmail and biting at the gorget on his neck. Amidst the snarls and growls, Theodore didn't hear the crossbow string twang nearby, but at that moment, the monster jerked, and its deadly grip weakened. Taking advantage of the moment, the hunter shoved the beast off, rolling to the side. The creature lunged at him again, but received 2 bullets and recoiled, screaming in pain. Theodore hadn't hit the head or heart, but the wounds were severe. Despite this, the werewolf was ready to pounce on the hunters again. While Melissa reloaded her crossbow, her brother drew another pair of pistols from his bandolier and began moving in a semicircle, forcing the creature to keep both opponents in sight. The werewolf crouched, ready to pounce, and swung its head back and forth, tracking the hunters. Drool dripped from its half-open mouth, and the fur on its chest was soaked with blood. Even with pistols in hand, Theodore felt vulnerable, but this feeling kept him alert, preventing him from relaxing. He was experienced enough to know the inhuman agility with which these creatures could dodge an expected shot. Bring those who asked me to capture Weiss alive for study to this very moment, and let them explain how. The thought flashed through the hunter's mind. But wait, this isn't Weiss. Then who is it? The monster standing before the hunters wasn't a true werewolf. It didn't resemble any animal and looked like a gigantic, deformed creature covered in thick fur, still retaining some human features, which made it all the more repulsive. Its face bore no resemblance to Weiss's. The difference became even more apparent when the one they were actually hunting appeared in the doorway. The grenade couldn't hold off this cursed beast for long, but there was no time to compare werewolves, as the newcomer immediately lunged at Melissa, who was closer. Theodore shot at Weiss twice, giving his sister time to draw her sword and dagger. The first monster then attacked Theodore, forcing him to face it with unloaded pistols. The chainmail once again withstood the blow of claws as hard as steel, but the hunter rolled across the ground, frantically searching for a weapon. His hand found the hilt of his catsbalger, and its short blade slipped easily from the sheath. Parrying a couple of blows aimed at his head, Theodore slashed the monster's face, making it recoil. Though the heavy body no longer pinned him down, his own body was slow to respond. "Come on, man, get up, now with a jerk," he commanded himself. He managed to stand before the prey pounced again, dodged the leap, and struck several blows to its back and side. The werewolf turned, and they grappled. Theodore felt like a cat fighting off a large dog, but a damn angry and sharp-clawed cat. At that moment he hated the enemy so fiercely that he only thought about how to strike the creature before him harder. Finally, the werewolf stepped back a couple of paces, bleeding from numerous, but unfortunately not deep enough cuts, shook its head, and wiped the drool from its mouth with a paw in a disturbingly human manner. But it was only a moment, and before Theodore could catch his breath, the beast attacked again. Another fall, pain throughout his body. Then the fur blocking the sky disappeared. The hunter felt like a silver pitcher hammered flat and then roughly reshaped. Chainmail was usually enough to blunt most werewolf teeth, but sometimes a good cuirass on top would be nice. If only I knew where to fall, he thought grimly, rolling onto his stomach to make it easier to stand. Kneeling, Mornivand looked around. The beast that had knocked him down was already running towards the edge of the forest. Gunther Weiss was also trying to escape, but was struggling. He limped on his left leg and swayed side to side. Theodore found the last loaded pair of pistols among his arsenal, carefully aimed, tracking the prey's movements, and finally fired. Only one bullet hit. The werewolf fell face down, howled, then got up and continued towards the forest. Melissa did a better job on him than I did on mine. A prideful thought flashed. But noticing his sister still lying on the ground, all such considerations vanished. The elder Mornivan ran to his sister and bent over her. The chainmail was intact, though dirtied, and no fractures were felt. Only one side of her head had hair sticky with blood, and he noticed a severe bite just below the edge of her chainmail. Fortunately, contrary to popular belief, those bitten by werewolves didn't turn into werewolves themselves, so the bite posed no terrible threat. "I'm fine. I can stand on my own," Melissa said, seeing her brother's concerned face. Leaning on his arm, she straightened up. "Where are the werewolves?" "They fled into the forest. One went one way, the other another. Typical of Gunther. As soon as he feels the heat, he tries to escape." Theodore smirked. "But this time, he won't get far. Neither he nor that other beast. Both are wounded, and Gunther is barely limping." Melissa smiled proudly. "I managed to stab him through and wound his leg." "Good. They went in different directions, so we'll have to split up." "Not the best idea." "It's fine. They're severely weakened. I'll go after the first beast, and you after Weiss. I think you'll catch up to him quickly by following his trail and blood. He's badly injured, and finishing off that creature won't be difficult." The girl shrugged. "I don't need tracks to find him. I can sense the presence of evil. Mr. said it's a unique talent." Theodore nodded. "Yes, a rare gift. Let's hurry. But first take this pistol," he said, handing her a strange-looking contraption, devoid of any beauty or elegance. "I've told you. I don't want to bother with firearms. You won't have to do anything complicated. This is a 3-barreled pistol, already loaded and ready to fire. You cock the hammer, pull the trigger, then rotate the barrels clockwise until it clicks." He demonstrated. "Shoot again and turn it again. It's simple. I'll feel much better knowing you can give Gunther 3 pieces of lead. Finish him." Melissa took the pistol and tucked it into her belt. The Mornivans embraced and went in opposite directions. This forest was almost devoid of underbrush, and walking between the bare trunks was easy. Melissa moved quickly over the soft carpet of decayed leaves, barely glancing at the prey's tracks. She sensed the evil ahead so clearly that she could have followed it with her eyes closed. This feeling wasn't clear, not indicating who exactly emitted the dark aura. It merely warned of nearby danger and pointed to its source. It had become completely light, but the fog prevented her from seeing objects more than 50 feet away. The smell of damp wood and rotting leaves mixed with the sharp scent of Gunther, which occasionally wafted to Melissa's keen nose, akin to the odor of an overly sweaty person. This element of the forest aroma gradually intensified as she approached its source. In truth, the girl didn't want another encounter with the monster. The brief skirmish in the village was enough to remind her of one teacher's words. Hunting a werewolf is nothing like hunting a vampire. It's a lot of filth, blood, brute force, and facing such animal rage that if you manage not to fear and kill such an enemy, you'll be fully prepared to fight an entire pack of ordinary wolves. And they also told her that initially, novices were sent on missions that posed no significant danger to life and mainly served to practice theory in the field. Ironically, she was on the trail now only because she didn't want to appear cowardly to her older brother. His respect was more important than potential danger. The beast's blows had almost broken her bones, but seemingly there were no serious injuries. Only her head hurt, which had taken a good hit, and the bite on her leg burned. Before setting off in pursuit, Melissa had hastily bandaged her wounds, but would need to use ointments and remedies for quick healing. Suddenly, the huntress stopped to process her sensations. She felt her prey had stopped running and was instead circling, trying to switch places with the pursuer. Gunther must have realized he couldn't outrun the chase and decided to trap the girl. He flanked her and was now approaching from behind. Melissa turned and peered into the fog, expecting the golden-furred beast to emerge any moment. Nox et tenebrae et nubila, confusa mundi et turbida, lux intrat, albessit polus, Christus venit, dissedit. She recited the beginning of a suitable morning hymn, trying to calm her wild heartbeat. The huntress continued forward as if still searching for the prey's tracks. It took all her willpower to endure the unsettling feeling of an exposed back. Meanwhile, Gunther had approached so closely that the vibrating sense of evil reached its peak, and Melissa could no longer tell which direction it pointed. It felt as if the werewolf stood right before her. She couldn't take it and turned again, bringing her crossbow to her shoulder. Still, only tree trunks emerged from the fog. In the distance, she heard sounds made by some waking bird. A city dweller. Melissa couldn't identify its name. The girl began to lose her composure. She stared in vain at the surrounding forest. There was no sign of the beast. Yet the sense of danger reached its highest level. To calm herself, she checked her stance. Of course, gripping the crossbow too tightly would hinder accuracy. Melissa turned her left side forward and rested her left arm, supporting the heavy stock of the weapon on her side. Still, no sign of the beast. Her peripheral vision caught the body falling from above, and she shot an arrow as soon as the monster touched the ground. When the werewolf snarled and charged at the huntress, she already faced it with her sword and dagger. And they said werewolves don't climb trees. Well, this isn't a real werewolf, she thought, dodging the clawed paws. The monster rushed forward, intending to crush the spiky insect, but Melissa sidestepped the attack like a Spanish nobleman in a bullfight and drove her sword into where a human's liver would be. Before the beast could turn, roaring in pain, she slashed its leg. Now the creature's roar was no longer frightening. It had thinned to a pitiful whimper. The beast tried to rise but collapsed again. Seeing this, Melissa smiled and hurried to retrieve the pistol her brother had given her, to kill the monster without exposing herself to danger. But before she could cock the hammer, she saw the werewolf transforming into a human. He breathed heavily, leaning on all fours, and with each exhale his enormous body seemed to shrink, his shape changing with unpleasant sounds as if bones were breaking and reconnecting and internal organs tearing. The process repulsed the girl. But the most disturbing thing, for some reason, was seeing the same bleeding wounds on Gunther Weiss's pale, flabby body that she had inflicted on the werewolf. The goldsmith writhed, tensed, and finally managed to roll onto his back. Brown leaves and dirt clung to his hairless chest. He watched the huntress with haunted, bloodshot eyes. Now he didn't look dangerous or evoke hatred in Melissa, only disgust. God knows if he starts begging for mercy, I won't be able to cold-bloodedly shoot him in the forehead. This needs to end quickly, she thought, raising the pistol. No, Gunther wheezed. Please don't. He tried to crawl backward, pushing with his elbows. Don't shoot. I'm not a monster. I don't want to hurt anyone. Melissa's hands betrayed her, shaking, and the barrel wavered. She lowered the pistol and sighed. We lived in seclusion so as not to harm anyone if there were attacks. Please don't. The wounded man continued to whisper. What happened to you? How did you start turning into a beast? Melissa asked. She realized she even felt sorry for this unfortunate soul. When he was in beast form, such thoughts couldn't arise, but now... The wounded man began to speak, but his voice was so weak she couldn't make out the words. With gestures, he asked the huntress to come closer and listen. Melissa stepped forward and leaned in, straining to catch every sound. As soon as she did, Gunther attacked, discarding feigned weakness and beginning to transform back into a beast mid-lunge. Theodore could now see the prey's back flitting among the trees. The distance was gradually closing, and he waited for a chance to shoot. His own bruises and pain receded to the background in the thrill of the chase. These were the moments he loved most. Chasing the enemy, feeling their despair, and watching them helplessly scramble for escape. Mornevan deliberately prolonged the pleasure, not running at full speed. There was no way the monster could escape, having received so many wounds. He knew exactly how it must feel every embedded bullet from his pistols inherited from a man of true faith, as if being shot point-blank repeatedly in the same spot. And then there was the wound from Melissa's blessed crossbow, made more painful by her sincere religiosity. Moreover, this monster wasn't a real werewolf. It lacked the corresponding vitality, rapid healing, and tenfold strength. Finally, Theodore grew tired of the run. He had always been too heavy for long distances. The hunter increased his pace and, deciding he was close enough, stopped, aimed instantly, and fired both barrels. The beast staggered, took a few more uncertain steps, then fell forward, rolling into a nearby ravine. With one hand, Theodore adjusted his broad-brimmed hat, almost knocked off during the chase, and began descending slowly after the werewolf, tucking the discharged weapon into his belt and drawing his favorite cavalry pistol. Its long barrel improved accuracy, and the enclosed wheel lock was utterly reliable in rain, mud, and wind. Mornevan lovingly stroked the engraving on the metal, then lowered the flint onto the serrated wheel. One pull of the trigger, and the wheel would spin, instantly igniting the powder with sparks. The beast backed away from the approaching man until it bumped into a massive beech. The hunter also stopped. From 5 steps, he could easily plant a bullet right between the eyes. Capture alive for study? To hell with it. If something similar appears again, then we'll think about it, but now... The beast began to change rapidly. It convulsed and dropped to its knees, then all fours. Soon, where the fur-covered monster had been, stood a beautiful woman of about 30. Interesting turn of events, Mornevan smirked. Who are you? I am Jeanne, Gunther's wife. She looked at the hunter very calmly, without the slightest hint of fear. Not at all embarrassed by her nakedness, her only attire being long black hair, nor concerned about the wounds on her chest and neck, which immediately started bleeding again after the transformation. From a distance, it would be easy to mistake sympathies. On one side, a white, delicate body, defenseless and beautiful. On the other, an armed-to-the-teeth man in a black cloak and hat, with a glinting circle of icons on its tall crown. A devilish sight, and his face was blackened from gunpowder smoke. Hardly a messenger of the Lord. "Why are you hunting us?" she asked. "We settled far from people, thinking we'd be left alone, that we'd be allowed to live out our days. I came for you because you're already dead. You damned your souls the moment you became monsters, abhorrent to God. And I just brought your bullets." Yet he lowered his hand with the pistol. "By the way, how did you become like Gunther? He wanted to leave the city alone, but I couldn't let him go. How could I live without him? I love Gunther. Too much to part with him. So he bit me, because one bitten by a werewolf also becomes one. A werewolf's bite can't turn someone into a werewolf. That's just a silly myth," Theodore countered, feeling cold inside. Melissa, the hunter thought. She was bitten. Could this be another trait distinguishing these creatures from real werewolves? Then how did I gain the ability to turn into a beast? Only that way. I asked Gunther to do it. I wanted to be no different from him. It made it easier for him, too. He no longer felt alone. Her voice now held such tenderness and care. Love focused solely on one person, in its highest form, can make one as blind and deaf to others as extreme selfishness. It then gives the lover a universal justification for any crime. If her dear Gunther were tearing apart a child with his claws right now, and I tried to stop him, she'd tear out my throat, Theodore thought, studying Jean's face. She was truly beautiful. He had often seen men lose their heads over such women, sometimes literally. He raised the pistol again, aiming at her heart. All burghers are the same. They only care about their happiness, the peace of their little world. They disgust me, with their petty souls, their narrow-mindedness, and their primitive minds. And people like you and Gunther disgust me twice as much. Every hunter must have a reason for killing monsters. Theodore Mornevand had none. But he hated each individual enemy for different reasons. Gunther for his pitiful envy, Jean. Because he couldn't stand women who loved their husbands, regardless of what scoundrels and villains they were. "Can you really shoot a defenseless woman?" she asked, her beautiful eyes widening slightly in feigned surprise. "What kind of man would you be after that? You're not a woman, you're not human, and in the name of our Lord I will send you to hell. We're not monsters. Let us go," she said. "We don't want to harm people." Finally, there's a plea in her voice, the hunter thought with satisfaction. You're all the same beasts. When cornered, you humbly beg for mercy, because every beast is cowardly, and when it feels a superior force, it's ready to grovel before it. Lone wolves, damn you. See, I can't leave you in peace. It would harm my dream. What dream? To gain the reputation of a hunter who never let a filthy monster escape alive. A soft, hissing shot rang out. The bullet seemed to pin the woman to the tree. Then, without a sound, Gunther's wife fell to her knees. She brought a hand to the new wound and felt it. Mornevand drew another pistol from his bandolier, cocked the hammer, and without moving, fired a second bullet into her forehead. This time it was definitely over, though not neatly. The hunter crossed himself with the smoking pistol and recited a prayer for the soul of the slain. Quae sumus, Domine, pro tua pietate miserere animae famulae tuae, et a contagious mortalitatis exutam in aeternae salvationis partem restitue, per Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen. Now the souls of his friends, killed by Gunther Weiss, could find some peace. Wandering through the forest, Theodore found the site of Melissa's and Gunther's fight. The goldsmith lay on his back, limbs splayed awkwardly. Add a few more limbs, and he would look just like the Vitruvian man. Vitruvio architetto mette nelle sue opera d'architettura chez le misure dell'uomo. Theodore recalled the phrase under the corresponding drawing by the great Leonardo. He had read many of this scholar's works upon learning that Leonardo had invented his favorite wheel-lock mechanism. The scene was only marred by Gunther's head, which had been blown apart by a pistol shot. Not finding Melissa's body nearby, Mornevand looked around for her tracks. He soon found her crossbow with its string released. A bit further, he saw the steel gorget lying on the ground, the very one he had given her in the monastery armory. Theodore picked it up and examined it. The protective gear was intact, not torn off by the werewolf, but unfastened and removed by Melissa herself. She must have felt suffocated during the transformation. He soon found her tracks. Here Theodore paused, his heart clenched with pain, and his eyes filled with unbidden tears. One more step forward, and he would begin the hunt for his own sister. for what she has become, he corrected himself. But inside, everything rebelled. For my sister. He drew the cavalry pistol from his belt to reload it. This activity always calmed the feverish rush of thoughts. First, the hunter poured regular gunpowder into the barrel from a horn. The ability to gauge the correct amount by eye always comes with experience. Then he rammed it down with a wadding. He placed a bullet in the barrel, forced it down with effort. Another wadding. The ramrod took its place under the long barrel. Now Theodore poured fine priming powder onto the pan, closed the frizzen, and taking a key from his pocket, wound the wheel lock mechanism. The necessity of choice. He often faced it, calculating the lesser evil from possible options. Usually, Theodore didn't ponder long over how to act, as he had a pre-thought-out rule for each case, dictating the correct behavior. Recently, one such rule had helped him shut his heart to pity and kill Gunther's wife. But he had no rule for the case where his sister was doomed to become a werewolf. Or perhaps he did. The general principle that a hunter, under the influence of evil, must be destroyed as quickly as possible. Otherwise, they become one of the most dangerous enemies. The only question was whether to extend this norm to his sister, or forever feel unworthy of passing judgment when it came to killing anyone else. "Lord, why have you forsaken me?" the hunter groaned, throwing his head back to the gray sky. "Why have you given me scales with such heavy burdens?" He lowered the cock onto the wheel lock and quickly followed the trail. This time there was no thrill of the chase, and his face grew darker with each step. What had to be done brought Theodore no pleasure. The path led him to where the forester's hut stood. The fog had already cleared, and Mornevand could clearly see his sister. She stood on her knees beside the hut, her head bowed, her back to him. The leaves muffled his steps. Reaching shooting distance, Theodore raised the pistol, then lowered it. He bit his lip until it bled. He aimed the weapon at his sister again. His arm felt weak, and he had to support it with the other. "No," he thought, lowering the barrel to the ground again. "If I must do this, I need the courage to shoot not in the back, and not from afar." He approached. Melissa did not hear him until he stopped 2 steps away and called out to her. She lifted her head and brushed the hair from her tear-streaked pale face. "Finally, you're here, Theo," she said, breaking into a smile. "I was lonely without you." He shifted his hand to hide the pistol under his cloak. Her calling him by his childhood name shattered all his resolve. He tried desperately to regain his determination, but then Melissa stood and showed her palms. Both were cut in a cross pattern. Theodore knew why people did that. "Since there were no other options, I fought Gunther's bite like an ordinary werewolf's bite," she said. "Holy water, prosphora, burning with fire, prayers and litanies for this case. I had to fight the beast within, and I turned to the most human thing in us, our faith in God. And I managed to drive out the infection. If you want, check." Theodore drew the dagger from behind his back. It was made during the Reconquista for a knight of the Order of Santiago. A small cut did not make the girl writhe in unbearable pain. So the danger was indeed gone. There was no more reliable proof than proof by blood. Melissa's chance of salvation was minuscule, and yet she succeeded. Smiling, he covered her blood-stained hands with his, and his sister buried her face in his chest. She didn't know her brother was silently asking her for forgiveness. Later, Melissa slept, exhausted by the internal struggle, which had been harder than simply killing the werewolf, while her brother sat beside her with Cervantes's book in hand. He couldn't start reading, only pondering various thoughts. That the deaths of his friends were fully avenged. How envy could unleash the beast within a person, and how love could match it. That, however naive his sister's faith seemed to him, it helped her, whereas, in a similar situation, what would he appeal to in himself? He would probably shoot himself immediately upon feeling the infection. And what would Melissa do if her brother became a werewolf? However, such thoughts couldn't occupy his mind for long, and soon the desire to finish reading the book overcame his doubts and self-reproaches, especially since Theodore was not inclined to such introspection by nature. Finally, he stopped racking his brain over moral dilemmas and looked at his sister sleeping under his wide cloak. In sleep, her face was completely relaxed, like all kind and calm people, so she looked like a child. When Mornavand adjusted the cloak on her, Melissa sensed it, but only muttered sleepily, and continued sleeping, childishly pouting her lips. She still has room for compassion, even for werewolves. So, my dear Hermann, you're wrong in your predictions. As long as her heart isn't as cold as mine, she's more likely to become a dead hunter than the best. But who knows what the future holds? Life always changes people, even more than we'd like. He thought with a slight sadness, looking at his sister. You'll see. She'll show you all. Damn it, after all, her brother will be there to complete her training. Theodore smiled, opened the book at the marked page, and began reading a new chapter about the adventures of the ingenious gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha.